Late last month, Hurricane Helene made landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast as a Category 4 hurricane, with winds topping 140 miles per hour, causing deadly floods as it moved inland through Georgia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. Hundreds were killed. Entire towns were washed away. People remain stranded without electricity, depending on relief efforts to provide them shelter, water, and access to basic communication services. Hurricane Helene was one of the most deadly and costly hurricanes in recent memory, and the regions hit hardest are still in emergency relief mode, with actual recovery and rebuilding a very distant prospect. Despite the clear humanitarian crisis, the relief efforts and response to Helene has been politicized, with Republicans pawning conspiracy theories in a twisted effort to use the devastation left by Helene for political gain. Today, we're talking about conspiracy theories swirling about FEMA, Helene relief efforts, how this is all only going to get worse, and how Trump will get us to the bottom faster if he wins in November. Let's get into it. Thank you to my partner on today's video, PDS Debt. Credit card debt sucks. I've talked about this before, but I've been buried under more credit card debt than I care to admit to. And I can tell you that finally paying it off feels amazing, but it takes so much work because getting into credit card debt is really easy, but then getting out, the system's not set up for us. So if you're struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills, you need to check out PDS Debt. PDS provides a service to match you with debt solutions tailored to your financial situation, and they have a team of people ready to help you with your debt journey. PDS Debt is offering a free debt analysis. It only takes 30 seconds. Head over to pdsdebt.com/Miller to get your free debt assessment today. You'll receive a full breakdown on how to save on interest each month and the quickest way to take care of your debt. Everyone with over $10,000 in eligible debt qualifies, and there's no minimum credit score required. If you're making payments every month on your debt, but your balances just won't seem to go down, this program's for you. Stop waiting and start saving. Take advantage of PDS Debt's free debt analysis just for my viewers. Go to pdsdebt.com/Miller to complete the quick and easy debt assessment in just 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/Miller. Thanks, PDS Debt. Did you know these episodes are available in video form on YouTube or in podcast form on your favorite podcast platform? Just search Why America with Leeja Miller wherever you get your podcasts. At the end of last month, Congress approved a temporary budget to keep the government from shutting down, at least until after the election. In that budget, FEMA was given $20 billion for its disaster relief fund, but billions more were left out for supplemental disaster funding that FEMA had requested. And even that bill was voted against by a large number of Southern governors. One day later, Hurricane Helene hit. Senators and representatives from the worst-hit states actively voted against funding for FEMA in that stopgap bill, including Tim Scott of South Carolina, Ted Budd of North Carolina, Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, Matt Gaetz of Florida, and more. In even more Republican delusion, Mike Johnson said the FEMA stopgap funding is sufficient, and there's no need for lawmakers to return from their recess early like Biden has suggested they might in order to address the ongoing disaster. This despite the fact that Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas recently told reporters that FEMA will run out of money before this hurricane season is over, as the agency is facing a multi-billion-dollar deficit. But no, our elected lawmakers can't be bothered to work because, well, they were promised a break. Since the storm, which led to the deaths of 230 people and counting, with hundreds more unaccounted for, in addition to $160 billion of estimated losses, the very same states where their elected leaders voted not to fund FEMA, and where the majority of voters may very well vote in a man who wants to do away with the entire agency, are having to dedicate entire pages on government websites to try to combat various conspiracy theories, some of which have been floated by the Republican presidential nominee, Trump himself. We've reached a point in this country where not only is climate change politicized, but the individual storms and relief efforts meant to save lives are also becoming political fodder. Lucky for all of us, one little known fact about me is I wrote a law journal article like 5 years ago all about FEMA and disaster response in the US in the fallout after Hurricane Maria in 2017, which left the island of Puerto Rico devastated. Now, there are some very specific intricacies to that storm because of the complicated colonial relationship our government has to Puerto Rico, but much of the same information holds, and nothing has been improved since then. And it remains true, as it was with Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria, and Hurricane Helene now, that our government's ability to respond to disasters and, more importantly, prepare for disasters that are going to continue to become more numerous and more powerful is despicable. Despite the fact that people have been screaming about pre-disaster mitigation, that is, putting measures in place before a disaster hits, for decades. $1 spent in pre-disaster mitigation saves $4 in post-disaster cleanup. So our lack of preparedness is also costing taxpayers a ton of money. And I wrote 31 heavily researched and edited pages, including 171 fact-checked footnotes over the course of 2 years. And even with all the nuances in disaster mitigation and recovery, the ultimate cause of this country's inability to prepare for and provide immediate relief after disaster is a lack of funding. Full stop. We have the experts to provide the foresight and oversight. We have the technology to improve mitigation efforts, to build levees, enhance electrical grids, etc. We have the knowledge and technology to provide swift recovery services after disaster strikes, like heat detecting drones to find people alive in rubble, for example. But we do not have the political will necessary to provide the funds not only for the relief efforts, but also for the upfront investment in disaster mitigation before disaster strikes. Because do not be mistaken, it's about political will, not availability of resources. The money exists. It exists in the pockets of billionaires who have bought out our politicians so they can benefit from legal loopholes that allow them to pay criminally small percentages of their fortunes in taxes, while their corporations do the polluting that leads to increased disasters and need for funds. It exists in the money being sent to Israel to bomb babies and genocide entire populations. The money exists. It's the political will that's the problem. And politicians on both sides of the aisle are bought and sold by billionaires, for sure. But it is Republicans who are not only benefiting from money in our politics, but also are then turning around and telling their constituents that they'll lower taxes, that climate change is a hoax, don't trust science or experts or elites in the government, and that FEMA isn't funded because immigrants took the money. Frankly, I'm shocked they haven't figured out how to blame climate change itself on immigrants yet, though I'm sure it's coming down the pipeline. Here are some conspiracies that have come out of the Helene relief efforts and what's actually happening. Number one, FEMA is underfunded because of immigrants. Republicans, headed by Donald Trump himself, are peddling the lie that $650 million in FEMA funds have been handed out to illegal aliens. The reality is that that number came from the Shelter and Services Program within FEMA, which distributed that amount of money this fiscal year. However, the funds come from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection budget and are sent to FEMA solely so the agency can distribute the funds to migrant support groups, nonprofits, and state and local governments to distribute to those in need of shelter, food, or medical care. So this money does not come out of the FEMA budget, and it's meant to help facilitate the safe, orderly, and humane release of asylum seekers and families. Reminder that asylum seeking in the U.S. is legal. And even if that $650 million was from the FEMA budget, FEMA's total budget is around $33 billion annually. That $650 million represents just 2% of FEMA's budget. It's just not true to say that FEMA doesn't have money because of immigrants. FEMA doesn't have money because of billionaires not paying their fair share and a lack of budget allocation by Congress. Number two, more aid was sent to Democratic counties. According to FEMA, the agency has shipped over 8.8 million meals, 7.4 million liters of water, 150 generators, 225,000 tarps, had over 1,600 interactions with people and animals, including rescues and evacuations, and sent crews to help restore power and set up satellite internet links for those without service. These have been distributed throughout the affected area, and no one in FEMA is sitting down to look at maps of counties and determine which one voted for Biden in 2020. As of yesterday, in North Carolina alone, where Trump won in 2020, there were more than 700 FEMA employees and over 1,000 National Guard personnel. FEMA had approved $30 million in housing and other assistance, and nearly 1,700 people were housed in hotels through a FEMA program, according to officials. There are reports on the ground from people in red towns saying they haven't seen any federal response. But there are also reports that misinformation has been sullying the federal response that is available, with crews being sent on rescue missions only to find no one to rescue when they get there. Multiple Republican governors and legislators of Republican states have thanked the federal government and praised their efforts. Is the response perfect? Absolutely not. FEMA has a history of bungling disaster response, from Hurricane Katrina to Superstorm Sandy and more. So I'm not saying we should take their word as gospel or deny any missteps by FEMA. But to say the agency is purposefully sitting down and doling out aid based on political affiliation is actually asinine. And even reports on the ground from people actively dealing with recovery efforts indicate that no one on the ground is currently thinking about political affiliation while dealing with acute disaster and human need. It's only the people unaffected, like Trump tweeting from his golden Twitter, that are interested in turning this into a political conspiracy. Number three, FEMA is stealing or turning away money and donations and outside help. Elon Musk, who this guy. He appeared at a Trump rally over the weekend, which is fucking rich, coming from a guy who was so concerned with previous owners of Twitter being politically affiliated. Ever the pot stirrer because he likes attention and is a literal sociopath who lacks the ability for human empathy, he tweeted that he had helicopters in the area trying to drop Starlink hardware, but FEMA was turning them away. The reality is that the airspace over the affected region has been inundated since the disaster struck. We can complain about bureaucracy and red tape all day, and I agree, it's a pain, whether you're at the DMV or trying to obtain disaster relief from FEMA, though the latter is obviously definitely worse. But the alternative reality that Republicans want is for all of this to be managed by private enterprise, where you have literal Temu-branded knockoff Bond villains like Elon Musk just willy-nilly sending in helicopters with zero prior approval, zero checking in with what's actually needed, zero oversight, zero understanding of how disaster response works or what's actively needed in the moment, and then getting mad and huffy when their help is turned away by the people with actual expertise who are actively on the ground trying to solve the problem instead of sitting in their probably very weird soulless mega mansions, pinky finger to the mouth, contemplating how to take over Mars. Like, touch some fucking grass. Holy shit. There is zero proof that FEMA is stealing donations and equipment. It's literally distributing millions and billions of dollars in aid as we speak. This allegation makes no sense. And FEMA, under its standard operating procedures, does not accept or take donations or food from donors or voluntary organizations. That's not FEMA's job. Its role is to distribute government funds. It is a government agency. Donations are handled by voluntary agencies with the capacity to store, sort, clean, and distribute donated items. That is not what FEMA does. If you want to donate to FEMA, pay your taxes, and push your elected representatives to properly fund the agency. And number 4, FEMA abandoned the village of Chimney Rock in North Carolina so that the Biden administration could mine lithium there. A public meeting in Rutherford County in the western part of North Carolina, which was devastated by the hurricane, is the source of this conspiracy theory. Despite the fact that I'm pretty sure the meeting was open to the public and was held between officials from several communities to discuss ongoing search and rescue efforts, social media posts claim that it was actually a secret discussion about bulldozing, confiscating, or selling land for profit or to mine lithium. From there, the conspiracy has taken on a life of its own, and now apparently FEMA is purposely letting a small village disintegrate so that the government can seize the land in order to mine lithium there. As one man, the chairman of the county commission who was present at the meeting, said, "The only lithium for sale in Rutherford County is at the local Lowe's stores in a 9-volt battery." It's a conspiracy based on nothing that is politicizing a community in the throes of search and rescue efforts and trying to even figure out how to begin to pick up the pieces as it continues to deal with an acute emergency situation after this disaster. Samantha Montano, an assistant professor of emergency management at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, told the New York Times, "I have been doing disaster work for nearly 20 years, and I cannot think of another acute disaster where there has been this much misinformation." This is the result. This is what happens when we allow politicians like Trump and his ilk to spread disinformation and lies, to convince their followers to disbelieve everything they hear from experts and authorities. When they feel they can't trust experts, then they have nowhere else to go to find information, sometimes life-saving information, except for disinformation peddlers on the internet. According to the New York Times, climate-related disinformation tends to surge after natural disasters, as it did last year after a string of heat waves, flooding, and wildfires. False claims attribute such events to globalist hoaxes, arson, and so-called energy weapons. They are often fueled by AI-generated or outdated footage or distorted reasoning from the oil and gas lobby, politicians, and even foreign influence operatives. That is the society we're creating, and it is a direct result of Trump's actions, of Elon Musk's actions, of Republicans' actions who are willing to ignore the truth if it gets them retweets and likes and clicks and votes. It hurts our society always, but it becomes especially severe, acute, and obvious in times of disaster, when clear information and communication is essential to save lives and mitigate risk, whether it's COVID-19 or a hurricane. When disinformation rules and distrust of experts is encouraged by elected officials, people die. And the people who die are not the disinformation peddlers in Mar-a-Lago or in whatever level of hell Elon Musk lives on. It's the poorest people. It's the people in rural America. It's the people in Asheville, North Carolina, who were completely taken by surprise because hurricanes aren't supposed to affect a city in the mountains 300 miles from any major body of water. But the lie that climate change is a hoax means that these storms will just get worse, and people further and further inland will be affected. And the poorest, most disenfranchised among us are the ones who will suffer the most. People who already don't have stable shelter to begin with. people who don't have the funds to simply rebuild and replace all their possessions, people who don't have second homes to flee to when disaster strikes. And those who don't pay the price with their lives and livelihoods and homes and towns will pay the price with their tax dollars, which will go to fund recovery efforts that were more expensive because of confusion, chaos, and disinformation, and because a lack of funding meant that there was very little mitigation before the disaster struck. Every $1 spent to protect against future storms is $4 saved in post-disaster rebuilding. We pay for that. Not the billionaires tweeting lies or the politicians they own spreading rumors. Us. We deal with it. And under Trump, it will only get worse. Kamala Harris was the tie-breaking vote in the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate bill in U.S. history. As vice president, Harris announced more than $1 billion in grants in 2022 for states to address flooding and extreme heat exacerbated by climate change, at the time saying, "The frequency has accelerated in a relatively short period of time. The science is clear. Extreme weather will only get worse, and the climate crisis will only accelerate." The economic plans she's released for her administration propose increasing affordable energy-efficient housing and finding ways for faster implementation of clean energy and infrastructure initiatives. She also said repeatedly during the presidential debate that she's pro-fracking. So like I've said repeatedly, she is not a perfect or a progressive candidate. But my friends, the bar is on the fucking floor right now for this election. So the fact that she confirms climate change is real and causing increased natural disasters is a much better starting point to push her further on climate change than under a Trump presidency. We don't have a clear plan or concepts of a plan from Trump about what will happen to FEMA if he wins again, but two things help elucidate what we'd have in store in Trump's second term: what he did during his first term, and what Project 2025's blueprint says about FEMA. As president, Trump oversaw the relief effort for Hurricane Maria in 2017, which devastated Puerto Rico, and the island is literally still recovering from it. By 2019, Trump decided Puerto Rico had received enough aid and openly opposed further disaster relief aid to Puerto Rico, claiming instead that it should go to the mainland, which was also suffering from multiple natural disasters, because that's how climate change works, you fucking idiot. But even though he claimed he wanted the money redirected, his qualms over funding for Puerto Rico held up important aid packages in 2019, including a disaster aid package that was passed in the House but got tangled up in the politics of a partial government shutdown and Trump's demands for a wall along the US-Mexico border. In the case of Puerto Rico, it was easy for Trump to pull the strings of racism and colonialism to divert attention and claim that the money should go to better causes. Now, the disaster has struck the heart of his base, rural Southerners. So he's once again pulling the strings of xenophobia to divert attention to immigrants stealing our FEMA money, to distract from the fact that FEMA is underfunded because not only of Republican policies, but also his own efforts to undercut trust in science, in government agencies, and to encourage others to spread disinformation that is leading directly to further death and destruction with every new natural disaster. Project 2025 will take Trump's first term and put it on steroids. Not only does the project call for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which houses the National Weather Service, to be broken up, downsized, and privatized, see page 675, but it goes even further. Page 135 says, "The bloated DHS bureaucracy and budget, along with the wrong priorities, provide real opportunities for a conservative administration to cut billions in spending and limit government's role in Americans' lives. These opportunities include privatizing TSA screening and the Federal Emergency Management Agency National Flood Insurance Program, reforming FEMA emergency spending to shift the majority of preparedness and response costs to states and localities instead of the federal government, and eliminating most of DHS's grant programs." So under Project 2025, FEMA would be drastically pulled back, and the federal government would tell the states, "Sorry, you're on your own," which means that the wealthiest states and the wealthiest counties and towns within those states would have the taxes to handle at least some disaster mitigation and relief efforts. But the poorest states and the counties and towns in them, many of which will likely vote Trump for president this November, would be absolutely, categorically fucked. Sorry, maybe try not being poor. States' rights. That also means that Black and brown people who disproportionately populate some of the country's poorest counties and towns, and who are overrepresented in the lowest income categories in this country, and therefore are already more vulnerable to the effects of climate disasters, will once again, as with all of our entire history, be completely with states' rights being used once again to justify a complete rejection of any responsibility for caring for the well-being of others, which is the literal point of government. And by saying this is actually a states' rights issue and we should solve chronic FEMA underfunding by making states pay for it, it completely removes any responsibility from the backs of the corporations pouring greenhouse gases into our air and polluting our waters, making natural disasters worse, along with the people getting filthy fucking rich off of those corporations who use tax loopholes to avoid paying taxes, have no one to answer to for their unconscionably high profits, CEO pay, and wage disparity, and get to run amok with the only Earth we have while the rest of us are literally dying because of it. Meanwhile, we're all infighting over conspiracy theories and politics, allowing those billionaires to continue profiting and giving literally zero shits about us other than when some of them, like Elon Musk, pop in once in a while to sow further chaos as though he's playing Sims and wants to see what happens when he removes our pool ladder or deletes the door and sets the house on fire. To them, this is all a game that does not and will never affect them, and we're all pawns squabbling over the scraps. This will only get worse under a Trump presidency. Please vote for Kamala Harris on November 5th. Are you registered to vote? Please double check. States are kicking people off their voter rolls. Go to vote.gov for more information. Special thanks to members on Patreon who support this podcast. If you want ad-free, uncensored access to all these episodes, check out my Patreon today. Go to patreon.com/LeejaMiller to join. Extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons, T. Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. And if you like this episode, I highly recommend you check out my episode from last week, reacting to the vice presidential debate. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.